3 sharp knocks hit my door at 2 in the morning, and I knew before I opened it that something was wrong. Nobody knocked on Havel Station at that hour, unless they were drunk, desperate, or dangerous. I grabbed the torch wrench from my workbench out of habit, the heavy kind that could crack a bolt or a skull with equal efficiency, and crossed the dark apartment in 4 steps. I pressed the release panel, and the door slid open. Lyrae Selvan stood in the corridor light, and the sight of her stopped me cold. She was my neighbor, the quiet Selvari woman from the unit next to mine. Tall, silver-blue skin that normally carried a soft glow, large dark eyes that usually held a calm dignity, even when the rest of the block was loud and messy. I had lived next to her family for 2 years. We exchanged nods. I helped carry supplies once. Her husband Vorath died 6 weeks ago in a mining accident, and I left a meal outside her door because I did not know what else to do. That woman, the composed one, the dignified one, was gone. The person standing in my doorway was shaking so hard her bioluminescence was flickering in uneven pulses, like a lamp about to die. Behind her legs, pressed tight against her, were 2 small figures, her children. Saren, the older one, maybe 10 in human terms, stood rigid with her jaw clenched and her body angled between her mother and the open corridor like a shield. Kale, the younger boy, maybe 7, had his face buried in the fabric of his mother's clothes and would not look up. Lyrae spoke in English. Her accent was thick, her words careful, and each one landed like a stone dropped into still water. "They are coming for my children. You are the only one I can ask." I looked past her down the corridor, empty. The overhead lights hummed their usual flat tone. Nothing moved. "Who is coming?" I said. "The Keth Dominion, my husband's birth clan. They have filed a reclamation claim. Under Selvari law, when a bonded male dies, his clan has rights over the offspring, full rights. The mother has no standing." She said it the way someone says a thing they have rehearsed 100 times, trying to keep the emotion out and failing. "They will take Saren and Kyle. I will never see them again." I stood there with a torch wrench in my hand, and 2 decades of training telling me this was not my fight. I was a retired combat engineer. I came to Havel Station to disappear into the quiet end of a long, hard career. I fixed things. I ate alone. I went to bed early. I did not get involved in alien custody law or clan politics, or any of the 1,000 tangled species-specific disputes that happened on a frontier station with 40,000 residents from a dozen different worlds. That was the smart voice in my head, the practical one. Then Kale looked up at me. His eyes were enormous and wet, and full of a terror that no child of any species should ever have to carry. And the smart voice went silent. "Come inside," I said. I locked the door behind them and set the wrench on the counter. Lyrae guided the children to the narrow couch against the wall, and Saren sat down first, pulling Kale against her side with the practiced motion of someone who had been doing it for weeks, protecting him, holding him together. I made coffee. It was the only thing I knew how to do in that moment, and there is something about the ritual of it, the grinding and the boiling and the waiting, that has always felt like a promise. Like sitting down with a hot cup means you have decided to stay and deal with whatever comes next. I set a cup in front of Lyrae. She did not drink it, but she wrapped both hands around it and held on like it was the only warm thing left in the universe. "Start from the beginning," I said. She told me everything. Vorath had been Selvari, born into the Keth Dominion, one of the old clans that controlled vast stretches of territory in the Selvari home systems. He left the clan young, married Lyrae, who was from a smaller, independent community. They came to Havel Station together for work, for distance, for a life that was theirs instead of the clan's. The Keth did not forget. They never forgot. When a clan member left, they tolerated it as long as the member was alive. But death triggered the old laws. Reclamation. The children of a dead clan member were clan property. They would be taken back to Keth territory, raised in the clan's traditions, and the mother's name would be struck from their records as if she had never existed. "This is legal?" I asked. "Under Selvari law, yes." "And the station?" Lyrae's hands tightened around the cup. "The colony charter defers to species-specific domestic law for internal matters. Every species on this station either has similar traditions or considers it none of their concern. Every species? She looked at me then, and the expression on her face was something I will never forget. It was not hope exactly. It was something more desperate than hope. It was the look of someone who had searched every possible option and found only one door left. Humans are the only ones, she said. Your people are the only ones whose law says a child belongs with its mother. Your people are the only ones who fight for that. I sat back in my chair. The coffee was bitter and too hot, and I drank it anyway. How long do we have? The formal notice said 48 hours. The enforcers are in transit. How many? I do not know. The Keth do not send one. I was about to ask her more about the legal process, about who on the station might help, about what kind of challenge we could file, when my door panel chimed. Not a knock. A station notification. Priority class. I crossed to the panel and pulled up the message. It was from station administration, a routine docking advisory forwarded to all residents in the port-adjacent blocks. A Keth Dominion diplomatic envoy had requested and received expedited docking clearance. Their courier ship had entered Havel Station's approach corridor 11 minutes ago. Estimated dock time was less than 3 hours. 48 hours, they told her. 48 hours. I read the notice twice to make sure I was not misreading it, and then I turned back to Lyrae. Her bioluminescence had gone almost completely dark, which I had never seen before. The children had not moved. They lied about the timeline, I said. Yes. They are already here. Lyrae closed her eyes. Saren pulled Kale closer. Okay, I said, and I could hear my own voice shift into the register I used to use in the field when a situation went from bad to critical, and the only option was forward. Okay. New plan. Tell me about Vorath. Tell me how he really died. Lyrae opened her eyes. The flicker in her skin stabilized into something harder, something that looked less like fear and more like a cold, burning resolve. It was not an accident, she said. Vorath told me things before he died. He found something in the deep mines. Something they wanted hidden. He said if anything happened to him, I should not trust the clan. He said they would come for the children, not because of tradition, but because of what he knew and what he might have told us. What did he find? He did not tell me the details. He said it was safer if I did not know. But he was afraid, and Vorath was never afraid of anything. I sat with that for a long moment. A dead man who found something worth killing over. A clan that traveled across systems at diplomatic speed to collect 2 children. A timeline that shrank from 2 days to 3 hours without warning. This was not a custody dispute. This was a cleanup operation. I looked at Saren. The girl was watching me with dark, steady eyes that held far more understanding than any child should have. She had placed herself between her mother and every possible threat since they walked through my door. She had not said a single word. All right, I said. Here is what we are going to do. Nobody leaves this apartment until I figure out the legal angle. There is a process for challenging species-specific law under the colony charter. I do not know the details yet, but it exists, and I am going to find it. In the meantime, that door stays locked, and nobody opens it for anyone who is not me. Lyrae nodded. And Lyrae? Yes? When you said I was the only one you could ask. Why me specifically? There are other humans on this block. She looked at me with those large dark eyes and said something that sat in my chest like a weight. Because Vorath spoke of you once. He said you were a man who fixed things that other people said could not be fixed. He said you would not stop until the work was done. I barely knew her husband. We shared a corridor and a polite nod, but somewhere in those small daily moments, he had been watching, measuring, deciding who to trust if the worst came. And the worst came. I picked up the torch wrench again, not because I expected to use it, but because the feel of a tool in my hand reminded me of who I was. A man who fixed things. I pulled up my terminal and started searching for the Universal Residence Rights Clause. The clock on my wall read 2:17 in the morning, and somewhere in the docking ring, A Keth Dominion ship was sliding into port carrying people who intended to take 2 children from their mother and make them disappear. Not tonight. Not while I was standing. The next 3 hours were the longest of my life, and I spent them staring at legal text on a screen that made my eyes burn. The Colony Charter of Havel Station was a sprawling document written by committee, full of careful language designed to keep a dozen species from going to war in the same corridor. Buried in Section 9, Subsection 14, I found what I was looking for. The Universal Residence Rights Clause. It said that any permanent resident of Havel Station could file a protective residency claim on behalf of another resident if they believed that species-specific domestic law posed an immediate threat to the safety, well-being, or fundamental rights of that resident or their dependents. Once filed, all enforcement actions related to the dispute were suspended for 72 hours pending council review. It had never been used, not once in the station's 20-year history. It was a theoretical safeguard that nobody ever expected anyone to actually invoke. I filed it at 5:14 in the morning. The system accepted it, generated a case number, and sent automated notifications to station administration, the Human Affairs Office, and every relevant department in the governance chain. By the time the station woke up for its day cycle, the filing was already moving through the system like a stone dropped into a machine. The response was immediate and hostile. My personal comm lit up with a priority message from the Human Affairs Office at 6:30. A man named Conrad Perry, the senior human liaison on the station, wanted to see me in person within the hour. I told Lyrae to keep the door locked, told Saren to open it for nobody, and walked 3 levels up to the administrative ring. Perry was a thin man, with tired eyes, and the careful posture of someone who spent his life trying not to offend anyone. He sat behind a desk covered in data pads and looked at me like I had set fire to his office. "Do you understand what you have done?" he said. Filed a legal claim. "You have challenged Selvari clan law. The Keth Dominion is a major political entity in this sector. Their trade agreements with this station fund 1/3 of our operating budget. And you, a retired engineer with no legal training, have just told them that their 5,000-year-old domestic traditions do not apply here." "Do they?" Perry blinked. "Excuse me? Do their traditions apply here? This is not Keth territory. This is a multi-species colony operating under its own charter, and that charter has a clause that says residents can challenge domestic law. I used it. That is how law works." Perry stared at me for a long time. Then he pulled up his terminal and read through my filing. When he finished, he leaned back and rubbed his face with both hands. "The claim is technically valid," he said. "The system accepted it. The 72-hour hold is in effect. But you need to understand that the Keth are not going to sit quietly for 3 days. They have already filed a formal protest through their diplomatic envoy, and there is a Keth enforcer named Dravek Keth Voran who has been requesting a meeting with station security since he docked." "What kind of enforcer?" "The kind that makes problems go away." I left Perry's office and headed back to the residential block. The corridors were busier now, morning shift traffic flowing toward the mine access and the commercial ring. I moved through the crowd and tried not to think about the fact that somewhere on this station, a Keth enforcer was sitting in a room, planning how to take 2 children from their mother. When I reached my floor, I found Garza Montoya leaning against the wall outside my door. Garza lived 3 units down. He was a human dock worker, broad-shouldered, loud, and built like something designed to move heavy objects through narrow spaces. We drank together sometimes. He was not subtle, but he was solid. "Heard there was some excitement last night," he said. "How?" "The docking advisory. A Keth diplomatic ship showing up on expedited clearance is not normal. Then I saw your neighbor and her kids go into your apartment at 2 in the morning and not come out. Put it together." I told him the short version, the reclamation claim, the legal filing, the 72-hour window. Garza listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When I finished, he cracked his knuckles and said, "What do you need?" "I do not know yet. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. I know every dock worker on the cargo ring. Humans, Bravari, a couple of Torvani. If you need bodies in a corridor, I can fill one. I thanked him and went inside. Lyrae was sitting where I left her, the coffee untouched and cold. The children were asleep on the couch, Saren's arms still wrapped around Kale. I told Lyrae about the filing, the 72-hour hold, and the fact that the Keth had already pushed back. She listened and nodded. 72 hours. And then what? Then the council reviews the claim and decides whether the reclamation order stands or falls. And if it falls? Then I find another way. She looked at me with an expression I could not read, and said, "You should know that the Keth do not lose. Not in politics, not in law, not ever. They have been doing this for thousands of years. They have never dealt with humans." That was not bravado, it was a fact. In 20 years on Havel Station, no human had ever filed a challenge against species-specific domestic law. The Keth had no playbook for this, and in my experience, the most dangerous thing you could do to an opponent was give them a problem they had never encountered before. The day passed in tense quiet. I spent it on the terminal, researching Selvari clan law, the colony charter's review process, and every precedent I could find for cross-species custody disputes. There were almost none. The galaxy's legal systems were built on a foundation of mutual non-interference. Your species, your rules. Nobody questioned it, because nobody wanted their own traditions questioned in return. It was a system designed for convenience, not justice. At 1700 hours, my door chimed again. Not a station notification this time, a visitor. I checked the corridor camera. 3 figures stood outside my door. The one in front was tall, taller than Lyrae, with the same silver-blue skin but darker, almost gunmetal, and eyes that held no warmth at all. He wore formal clan attire, dark fabric with geometric patterns in deep red that I later learned marked him as Keth enforcement caste. Behind him stood 2 more Selvari, larger, broader, clearly there for physical presence. I opened the door. "Ethan Calloway?" The tall one's voice was smooth and controlled, every syllable placed with precision. "That is me. I am Dravik Keth Vorin, authorized representative of the Keth Dominion. I am here to execute Reclamation Order 7714, filed on behalf of the clan for the collection of Saren and Kale, offspring of the deceased Vorath Keth Selvan. I understand they are present in your residence." "They are. Then I will need you to release them into my custody." I leaned against the doorframe. I did not step aside. I did not invite him in. I did not move. "There is a protective residency claim filed under the colony charter, case number pending review. All enforcement actions related to this dispute are suspended for 72 hours. You know this, because the notification was sent to your diplomatic file 6 hours ago." Dravik's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A recalculation. "The claim is a procedural nuisance. It will not survive review." "Maybe. But right now, right here, it is the law of this station, and you cannot take those children while it is in effect." "You do not understand Selvari law, Mr. Calloway. I understand station law, and that is the law you are standing under." Dravik took one step forward. The 2 enforcers behind him shifted their weight. They were big. Not human big, but tall and dense, evolved from a predator lineage, on a world with heavy gravity and long nights. Their hands were large enough to wrap around my arm and snap it without much effort. I did not move. There is a thing that humans do that most species find confusing, and it is this. We do not back down from larger opponents. Every rational calculation says we should. We are not the strongest, the fastest, the most armored, or the most adapted to violence. But somewhere deep in our wiring, in the part of our brains that spent 100,000 years staring down predators on an open savanna, there is a circuit that says no. Not one more step. And when that circuit fires, nothing short of physical force will move us. Dravik saw it. I watched him read it in my posture, in my breathing, in the way my weight had settled into my heels. He was a professional. He knew what he was looking at. "This is a Selvari matter," he said, and his voice was quieter now, each word carrying a weight of implied consequence. Humans have no standing in our domestic affairs. Your interference will have repercussions. File a complaint. We stood there, two men separated by a doorway, and 5,000 years of different definitions of what a family was, and neither of us moved. Then a voice came from behind Dravik. "Everything all right out here?" "Garza." He stood at the far end of the corridor, arms folded, leaning against the wall with the studied casualness of a man who was very much not casual. Behind him, two more doors had opened. Neighbors. Humans. A married couple named the Drakes from 4 doors down. Behind them, a Bravari couple whose names I did not know, stepped into the corridor and stood there, watching. More doors opened, more faces. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The corridor filled with the quiet presence of people who had heard something happening and decided to witness it. Dravik looked at the growing audience. His enforcers shifted uncomfortably. This was not how these things were supposed to go. Reclamation was supposed to be quick, quiet, and absolute. You showed up, you presented the order. The mother wept, the children were taken, and everyone else looked away. Nobody was looking away. Dravik turned back to me. 72 hours, he said. When the hold expires and the council dismisses your claim, I will return. And there will be no corridor full of neighbors that changes what happens next. He left, his enforcers followed. The corridor stayed full for a long time after they were gone. I closed my door and leaned against it, and let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. My hands were shaking. Not from fear exactly, but from the adrenaline dump that comes after you stand your ground against something bigger than you and live to process it. I pressed my palms flat against my legs until the tremor stopped. Lyrae stood in the center of the room, her children behind her, and she was looking at me with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and terror. Kale had his face buried against her again. Saren had not moved from her position between her mother and the door. That girl had the instincts of a soldier and the composure of someone 3 times her age, and it broke something in me to see it. 72 hours, Lyrae said. We will find a way. You keep saying that. I keep meaning it. She lowered her voice so the children would not hear. Dravik is not an ordinary enforcer. In the Keth Dominion, enforcement caste operatives are selected from birth and trained in disciplines that most Selvari consider extreme. They do not fail. They are not sent on missions that are expected to fail. The fact that he is here, personally, means the clan considers this matter critical enough to send their best. Their best just got turned around in a corridor by a retired engineer and a dock worker. Their best just learned the layout of your apartment, measured your response time, cataloged every face in that corridor, and identified every person who stood against him. He was not retreating, he was gathering information. That sat heavy. I filed it away and kept moving. That night, after Lyrae and the children had settled into an exhausted sleep in my small bedroom, while I sat at the kitchen terminal going through legal files, I felt a tug on my sleeve. I looked down. Saren, the girl. She had crept out of the bedroom without a sound and stood beside my chair with those dark, steady eyes fixed on my face. My father gave me something before he died, she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. He told me to keep it hidden. He said to give it to a human. Only a human. She opened her small hand. In her palm, no bigger than my thumbnail, sat a microdata chip, standard format, the kind used for encrypted personal storage. It glinted under the kitchen light like a tiny silver eye. He said a human would know what to do with it. I took the chip from her hand and held it up to the light. Whatever Vorath had found in those mines, whatever secret was worth killing him over, whatever the Keth Dominion had crossed systems to bury, it was sitting in my palm. I looked at Saren. She looked back at me with the face of a child who had carried the weight of a dead man's secret for 6 weeks without telling anyone, and I understood then that this girl was made of something harder than grief. Go back to sleep, I said. I will take care of it. She nodded once and slipped back into the bedroom without a sound. I sat alone in the kitchen with the chip in my hand and the terminal glowing in front of me, and the knowledge that this had just become something much bigger than a custody dispute. I needed to see what was on this chip, but not here, not on my personal terminal, Not on anything connected to the station network. If Vorath was careful enough to hide his evidence in his daughter's hand, then whatever he found was dangerous enough that looking at it on an open system could get us all killed. I needed a shielded terminal. I needed help. I sent Garza a message, 3 words. Come over. Now. He was at my door in 4 minutes. I showed him the chip without explanation, and his face went through several expressions before settling on the one that mattered. I know a guy on the dock level who has a standalone terminal, he said. Air-gapped. No network connection. He uses it for side work. Can we trust him? He is human, and he hates the Keth because they shorted him on a cargo payment last year, so yes. We made a plan to access the terminal during the next shift change, when the corridors would be busy enough to provide cover. I put the chip in my pocket and felt its weight like a promise. Somewhere on this station, Dravek Keth Voran was planning his next move. Somewhere in the deep mines, whatever Vorath had found was still there, still hidden, still worth killing for. And I was sitting in my kitchen at 3 in the morning, a retired engineer who came here to be left alone, holding a dead man's secret, and wondering how everything had changed in a single night, because a widow knocked on my door. The dock-level terminal was exactly what Garza promised, a battered standalone unit tucked into a storage bay behind the cargo processing center, owned by a wiry, sun-starved dock worker named Simon Pruitt, who used it to manage his personal trade ledgers. No network connection. No station interface, just raw processing power behind a reinforced firewall. Simon asked no questions. He set us up, sealed the door, and stood watch outside with the casual stance of a man who had done this kind of thing before. I slotted the chip. The data unpacked in layers, and each layer hit harder than the last. Vorath had been methodical, precise, and thorough, the work of a man who knew he was building a case that might be the only thing standing between his family and oblivion. The first layer was mine survey data. Vorath had been assigned to deep shaft operations in Havel Station's primary mining network, routine geological assessment work in the lower tunnels that most workers avoided because the pressure was bad and the pay was not enough to compensate for the discomfort. During a standard scan of Tunnel Junction 47, his instruments picked up an anomaly. Heat signatures behind a sealed bulkhead that should have been solid rock. He investigated. He found that the sealed section was not sealed at all. It was a concealed access point, camouflaged behind false rock facing, leading to a secondary tunnel network that did not appear on any station schematic. The second layer was the concealed network itself. Vorath had gone in, alone, over the course of several weeks, mapping the hidden tunnels with his personal survey equipment. What he found was an active extraction operation running entirely off the books. Drilling rigs, processing equipment, cargo systems, all of it new, all of it sophisticated, all of it designed to operate without detection. The third layer was what they were mining. Viridium. I recognized the name because everyone in the engineering world knew it. Viridium was a restricted class mineral, one of the rarest and most tightly controlled substances in known space. In its raw form, it was a dense crystalline ore found in deep geological strata. In its refined form, it was the primary component in weapons-grade energy systems, the kind used in military-class warship batteries and orbital defense platforms. Its extraction, refinement, and sale were prohibited under the Galactic Arms Limitation Treaty. Anyone caught mining it without authorization faced sanctions that could cripple an entire nation. Someone was pulling Viridium out of Havel Station's bedrock and smuggling it off-world. The fourth layer connected the operation to the Keth Dominion. Equipment serial numbers on the drilling rigs traced back to Keth Dominion manufacturers. The cargo rail system matched specifications used in Keth military logistics. The atmospheric scrubbers were military-grade models that had no business being in a civilian mining operation, and the falsified cargo manifests, which Vorath had painstakingly compared against official station shipping records, showed a pattern of phantom shipments leaving Havel Station through channels that bypassed all customs inspection. The profit chain ran directly back to senior Keth clan leadership. Garza stood behind me, reading over my shoulder, and when the financial data came up, he let out a low whistle. "That is a lot of money," he said. It was. enough to fund a private fleet. Enough to shift the balance of power in 3 sectors. Enough to kill 4. The 5th and final layer was a personal log. Vorath's voice, recorded in low, careful Selvari that the terminal's translation software converted to English text. The timestamp was 3 days before his death. I know they have found me. The section supervisor asked questions today that told me they know someone has been in the concealed tunnels. They have not identified me yet, but it is a matter of time. I have sealed this chip and given it to Saren, because they will search Lyrae and our quarters, and they will search my work locker, and they will search everywhere they can think of, but they will not search a child. I am putting my trust in something Vorath Keth Selvan never believed in before he came to this station. I am trusting humans. Everyone says the same thing about them. They do not look away. When they see something wrong, they do not pretend they did not see it. They do not calculate whether it is convenient to care. They just act. I do not understand why they are like this. None of us do, but I am trusting it now, because there is nothing else left to trust. If you are reading this, and you are human, then my daughter found you. Please, do not look away. The recording ended. I sat in front of that terminal for a long time, staring at the screen, feeling the weight of a dead man's faith pressing down on me like a physical thing. Garza broke the silence. So, the reclamation claim is not about clan tradition. No. It is about getting his family into Keth territory, where nobody on this station can ask them what they know. Yes. And if the children disappear into the Dominion, the evidence disappears with them. That is the idea. Garza sat down heavily on a cargo crate and rubbed his jaw. What do we do? I pulled the chip from the terminal and held it in my closed fist. Winning the custody challenge is not enough. Even if the council rules in Lyrae's favor, the Keth will not stop. As long as that Viridium operation exists under this station, Lyrae and her children are targets. They will find another way, another legal angle, another quiet accident, another 6 weeks of patience followed by a knock on the door in the middle of the night. So we need to expose the whole thing. We need proof that cannot be dismissed. This chip is one man's personal data collection. Dravik's lawyers will call it fabricated. They will say Vorath was disgruntled, or unstable, or motivated by clan politics. We need corroboration from independent sources, and we need physical evidence from the tunnels themselves. You want to go down there? Someone has to. Garza looked at me like I had suggested walking into a fusion reactor. Vorath went down there. He did not come back. Vorath was a geological surveyor. I am a combat engineer. There is a difference. The difference is about 3 extra ways to die. I stood up and pocketed the chip. Start talking to your dock contacts. I need someone who handles outgoing cargo manifests. Someone who can confirm the phantom shipments independently. The more sources we have, the harder it is to dismiss. Garza nodded slowly. I know a couple of people. There is a Bravari engineer named Dorath who works station infrastructure. She has been complaining for months about unexplained power draws in the lower mine sections. She thought it was a grid fault. Might be interested to learn what is actually pulling that current. Talk to her. We left Simon's storage bay and split up. Garza headed for the cargo ring. I went back to the residential block to check on Lyrae and the children, and to start planning something that every sensible part of me said was a terrible idea. The day that followed was a careful dance of preparation and paranoia. I could not know how many eyes Dravik had on the residential block, so I moved carefully, varied my routes, kept my communications off the station network. Garza worked his contacts with the easy confidence of a man who had spent years building trust on the docks. By evening, he had 3 independent sources. The first was a Torvani cargo handler named Voss who had noticed irregularities in shipment weight logs for the past 18 months. Containers leaving through the lower docking ports were consistently heavier than their manifest declared, and the discrepancies were always explained away as calibration errors. The second was a human shift supervisor named Claire Beckett, who worked the night cycle on the ore processing level. She had been reassigned 3 times in the past year, each time away from sections that bordered the concealed tunnel network. She thought it was scheduling coincidence, until Garza explained what was actually down there. The third was Dorath. The Bravari engineer pulled the power consumption records for the lower mine grid. and confirmed that 3 sections were drawing 4 times their rated capacity, with no corresponding equipment on the official schematics. She was furious. As a station infrastructure engineer, unreported power loads were not just suspicious, they were dangerous. One overload could cascade through the grid and take out life support for the lower levels. Each source was a thread, and together, they wove a pattern that pointed to exactly what Vorath had documented. But threads were not proof. Threads were circumstantial. To shut this down permanently, someone needed to get into those tunnels and bring back physical evidence that could not be explained away. I spent the evening studying Vorath's survey maps from the chip, cross-referencing them with the station blueprints that Dorath provided. The concealed tunnel network had multiple access points, but most of them were sealed and monitored. One, however, stood out: an abandoned maintenance shaft on the edge of the mine grid, originally used for atmospheric venting during the station's construction phase, and decommissioned 15 years ago. It was not sealed so much as forgotten, and its access point was in a section of the lower levels that saw almost no traffic. Was my way in. While I planned, Dravik was not idle. He spent the day applying pressure through every official channel available. He filed a formal diplomatic protest against the protective residency claim. He requested that station security confine Liray to Selvari-administered quarters for her own safety. He submitted a brief arguing that my involvement constituted a violation of species sovereignty and should be sanctioned. And then, more quietly, he began making visits. Bravari shopkeepers who had stood in the corridor the night before found Keth enforcers browsing their stores, not buying anything, just standing and watching. The Torvani family, who had opened their door in solidarity, received a message reminding them that the Keth Dominion had significant trade interests on their homeworld. The message was polite, the implication was not. Some of the alien residents who had stood with us backed away. I did not blame them. The Keth Dominion had reach, and the courage to stand in a corridor for 5 minutes was different from the courage to stand against an interstellar power for days. The humans did not back away, not a single one. I do not say this to boast. I say it because it mattered, and because the reason it mattered was the same reason Vorath put his faith in us. Humans had a peculiar relationship with intimidation. The Keth were accustomed to a galaxy where the correct response to threats from a powerful entity was quiet compliance. Most species calculated the odds, weighed the consequences, and folded. Humans did the math too. We were not stupid, but somewhere between the calculation and the decision, something else intervened. Something stubborn and irrational, and fundamentally unwilling to concede a principle because someone with more power told us to. That night, with the corridor quiet and the station humming its mechanical lullaby, I sat in my kitchen and laid out my gear. Headlamp, portable scanner, atmospheric sampler, emergency pressure suit, compact model, the kind combat engineers carried for rapid deployment in compromised environments. A shaped charge, small, the size of my fist, enough to seal a tunnel behind me if I needed to cut off pursuit, and the torch wrench, because old habits die hard. Liray found me. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the gear on the table and said nothing for a long time. "You are going into the mines," she said. Yes. Vorath planned the same thing. He was going to go back in with a proper recording kit and document everything for a formal complaint. He told me the night before he died. I know. He did not come back. I met her eyes. She was not telling me this to stop me. She was telling me because she needed me to understand the weight of what I was doing, and because she had lost one person to those tunnels and was watching another walk toward them. I know, I said again. Then why? I thought about the question. I thought about Vorath's voice on that recording, steady and afraid, and trusting something he could not explain. I thought about Kale's face, and Saren's silence, and the chip in my pocket, and the 72-hour clock that was already half gone. Because if I do not, they win. Not just here. Everywhere. Every station, every colony, every corridor, where a mother is told her children do not belong to her. If nobody goes into that tunnel, if nobody brings back the proof, then this ends the way it always ends, quietly, with compliance. Liray reached out and placed her hand on my arm. Her skin was cool and smooth, and her bioluminescence pulsed once, a soft blue-white glow that I later learned was the Selvari expression of something that did not translate cleanly into English, but was closest to the word trust. "Come back," she said. "That is the plan." I finished packing my gear. Garza would be meeting me at the maintenance shaft access point at 0300, along with Dorath, whose engineering knowledge of the station's infrastructure would be critical for navigating the lower levels. 3 people going into a concealed illegal mining operation run by one of the most powerful clans in known space. It was not the smartest thing I had ever done, but smart had never been the point. I sealed my apartment door behind me and headed for the lower levels. The station was quiet around me, 40,000 lives suspended in the peaceful ignorance of sleep, and beneath their feet, buried in rock and silence, was a secret worth killing for. I intended to drag it into the light. The maintenance shaft was exactly as bad as I expected. Narrow, dark, and forgotten, with the kind of stale air that told you nothing living had passed through it in years. Dust coated every surface. The emergency lighting panels had died a decade ago and hung from the walls like blind eyes. Garza squeezed through the access hatch behind me, grunting as his broad shoulders scraped both sides of the opening. Dorath came last, her compact Bravari frame handling the tight space more easily. She carried an engineering scanner that could read structural signatures, chemical compositions, and energy patterns through solid rock, and she held it the way a soldier holds a weapon, with professional certainty. I took point. The headlamp cut a white cone through the darkness ahead, and I moved the way I was trained to move in confined environments. Slow, deliberate, one hand on the wall to feel for vibration, ears tuned for anything that did not match the station's ambient hum. "How far to the concealed network?" Garza whispered. According to Vorath's maps, about 400 meters down and 200 meters lateral. The maintenance shaft connects to a decommissioned ventilation trunk that runs parallel to the main mine grid. From there, we cut through a service junction, and we should be in range of the concealed tunnels. Should be. Should be. We descended. The shaft angled downward at a steady grade, following the curve of the station's outer shell into the geological substrate below. The air grew warmer and thicker, and my atmospheric sampler started picking up trace particulates that had no business being in a decommissioned shaft. Metallic compounds, refined dust, and something else, a faint luminescent residue on the tunnel walls that glowed pale green under my headlamp. Dorath scanned it. "Viridium particulate," she said, and her voice was tight. "Airborne trace from an active extraction process. The concentration is low but consistent. There is a mining operation within 500 meters of our position." We pushed on. The ventilation trunk was wider, designed for heavy airflow during the station's construction, and I could move at a better pace. The viridium trace grew stronger. The walls began to show signs of recent modification, new structural supports, fresh sealant on pressure joints, cable runs that were clearly modern and well-maintained. At the service junction, I stopped. The junction was a small chamber where 4 tunnels met, and one of them, the one heading southeast, had been fitted with a heavy-duty pressure door that was absolutely not part of the original station design. It was Keth military specification. I recognized the locking mechanism from field manuals I had studied during my service years. "That is our door," I said. Dorath scanned it. "Electromagnetic lock, biometric secondary, powered from the concealed grid. I can bypass the electromagnetic lock from the junction's original control panel, which is still wired into the station infrastructure. The biometric will not matter if the primary lock is disengaged." "How long?" 4 minutes. "Do it." She worked. Garza and I stood watch, facing opposite directions in the junction, listening to the silence. The station's ambient hum was different down here, deeper and more resonant, overlaid with a low vibration that I could feel through the floor. Machinery, heavy equipment running at a steady cycle. The viridium extraction was close. Dorath's bypass clicked. The pressure door hissed and released, swinging inward on hydraulic hinges. Beyond it, the concealed tunnel stretched ahead, and it was nothing like the forgotten maintenance shaft we had come through. This was a professional operation. The tunnel was wide, reinforced with structural alloy, lit by industrial strip lighting that cast a cold white glow over smooth walls. A narrow-gauge cargo rail ran along the floor, the kind used for moving heavy materials over short distances. The air was clean and pressurized, processed through the military-grade scrubbers that Vorath had documented. Everything was maintained, everything was operational, and everything was designed to run indefinitely without detection. We moved in. Dorath recorded everything, her scanner capturing structural data, chemical signatures, and equipment identifiers with the methodical precision of someone who understood exactly what kind of evidence would hold up under scrutiny. Serial numbers on the support beams, manufacturing stamps on the cargo rails, power draw readings from the atmospheric systems. The tunnel branched twice, and I followed Vorath's map at each junction, heading deeper into the network. The vibration in the floor grew stronger. The air carried a faint hum that was not mechanical but geological, the resonance of rock being cut at depth. We found the extraction site. It was a cathedral of stolen industry. The concealed cavern was enormous, carved from the station's bedrock with precision tools that had left the walls smooth and geometrically perfect. 4 massive drilling rigs stood in a row, each one sinking a shaft straight down into a viridium-rich stratum that Vorath's geological data confirmed extended for hundreds of meters. Automated processing equipment lined the far wall, converting raw ore into refined ingots that gleamed with a pale, dangerous light. A cargo staging area occupied the cavern's eastern end, stacked with sealed containers ready for transport. And beyond the staging area, visible through a wide tunnel opening, was a docking port. A concealed docking port built into the station's underbelly, invisible from the exterior, connected by a pressurized access tube to open space. This was how they moved the Viridium off station, directly from the mine to a waiting ship, bypassing every customs checkpoint, every inspection protocol, every safeguard that the colony charter required. "Get all of it," I said to Dorath. "Everything, every serial number, every chemical reading, every structural signature." She was already scanning. Garza moved to the cargo staging area and began reading manifest labels on the containers, cross-referencing them with the shipping records we had obtained from the dock contacts. The matches were immediate and damning. Container numbers that appeared on official customs logs as containing processed ore shipments were actually Viridium loads routed through the concealed docking port. I was examining one of the drilling rigs, looking for the manufacturer's identification plate that would provide a direct link to Keth Dominion supply chains, when the alert came. Not an alarm, nothing that loud or obvious. A subtle change in the air pressure, a shift in the vibration pattern beneath my feet, and a sound that I recognized from 20 years of operating in hostile environments. Footsteps, multiple sets, moving fast and moving with purpose. "We have company," I said. Garza's head snapped up. Dorath froze mid-scan. I killed my headlamp and moved to the cavern's entrance, pressing flat against the wall and looking down the tunnel we had come through. 4 figures, Keth enforcers, armed, wearing tactical gear designed for close-quarters operations in confined spaces. They moved in a 2x2 formation, covering each other's sightlines, sweeping the tunnel ahead with handheld illuminators. They were not searching randomly. They knew someone was in the network. "Back exit?" Garza whispered. "The concealed docking port. But it is a dead end, unless there is a ship on the other side." "Then we go through them?" I looked at the 4 enforcers approaching through the tunnel. They were Selvari, evolved from predator stock, adapted to low-light conditions, physically stronger than humans, and trained for exactly this kind of engagement. Going through them head-on in a narrow tunnel was suicide. "We go around them," I said. "Dorath, is your scan complete?" 80%. "That will have to be enough. Save everything and seal the scanner." I pulled up Vorath's map on my wrist display and found what I needed. A ventilation shaft running parallel to the main tunnel, accessible through a maintenance panel in the cavern's processing section. It was narrow, designed for atmospheric equipment rather than personnel, but it would take us past the enforcer position and back to the service junction where we had entered. We moved fast. I popped the maintenance panel and Dorath went in first, followed by Garza, who had to turn sideways and exhale to fit through the opening. I replaced the panel behind us, and we crawled through the vent shaft in darkness, guided by my wrist display and the sound of our own breathing. The shaft was tight enough that my shoulders brushed both sides with every movement, and the air inside was hot and stale, recycled through filters that had not been maintained since the shaft was decommissioned. Garza's breathing was loud and strained behind me, and I could hear the effort it cost him to drag his frame through a space designed for pipe access, not people. But he did not stop. He did not slow down. He kept moving, meter by meter, because that was what needed to happen. Behind us, I heard the enforcers enter the cavern. Voices in Selvari, sharp and urgent. They had found our entry point. They knew someone had been here. They knew someone had seen everything. The vent shaft dumped us into a secondary tunnel that ran back toward the service junction. We moved at a run now, abandoning stealth for speed. My headlamp bounced wild shadows off the walls, and the sound of our boots echoed ahead and behind us. The enforcers would realize within minutes that we had used the ventilation system, and they would redirect to cut us off. I heard them reroute. The sound of heavy footsteps shifted from behind to our left, moving through a parallel passage that, if they were fast enough, would intercept us at the service junction. They knew this tunnel network better than we did, and they were faster. "They are flanking us," Dorath said between breaths. "I know. Run faster." I reached the service junction first, and turned to check the tunnel behind us. Clear. Garza came through next, breathing hard, his face sheened with sweat and grime. Then Dorath, scanner clutched to her chest, like it was the most valuable thing on the station, which at that moment it was. "The maintenance shaft," I said. "Same way we came in. Move." We were halfway up the maintenance shaft when I heard them. The enforcers had found our trail and were closing fast, their footsteps echoing up the narrow passage with a rhythm that said they were running. "Garza, take Dorath and get to the surface. Get that scanner to the residential block. Do not stop for anything." "What are you doing?" I pulled the shaped charge from my kit. Small, precise, exactly enough to collapse the shaft ceiling at a single point and seal the passage behind us. "Buying time." Garza did not argue. He grabbed Dorath's arm and hauled her up the shaft at a pace that left scrape marks on the walls. I set the charge against the tunnel ceiling, wedging it into a stress fracture in the rock, where the blast would propagate along the natural fault line and bring down just enough material to block passage without compromising the structural integrity of the surrounding sections. Combat engineering. Know what to break and how much. I triggered the charge and threw myself forward, as the tunnel behind me coughed dust and thunder. The ceiling came down in a controlled avalanche, rock and debris filling the shaft in a dense plug that would take heavy equipment to clear. I ran. Dust chased me up the shaft, coating my lungs and my eyes and every exposed surface. Ahead of me, light bled down from the access hatch, and I clawed my way up the last 10 meters on hands and knees and spilled out onto the floor of the lower levels like a man pulled from a grave. Garza hauled me to my feet. Dorath was already sealing the hatch behind us. My ears were ringing and my hands were bleeding and there was stone dust in my teeth, but the scanner was intact and the evidence was saved. We made it to the lift system and rode it up 6 levels to the residential ring in silence. 3 battered, filthy people standing in a public elevator and trying to look like they belonged there. A Torvani shift worker gave us a long look and said nothing. When we reached the residential block, I knew something was wrong before we rounded the corner. The corridor was too quiet. The ambient lighting had been switched to emergency mode, casting everything in amber. And standing at both ends of the hall, positioned at every access point, were Keth enforcers in full tactical equipment and station security officers who looked deeply uncomfortable with what they had been ordered to do. The residential block was cordoned. Gunarza stopped. "What is this?" I pushed past him and approached the nearest security officer, a young Bravari in standard station uniform, who flinched when she saw the state of me. "What is happening here?" "Containment order, issued by Councillor Rannick's office at the request of the Keth diplomatic envoy. There was a reported disturbance in the human residential sector. All residents are confined to their units pending investigation." "What disturbance?" The officer hesitated. "I do not know the details, sir. We were just told to hold the corridor." I looked past her. Inside the cordon, our neighbors were visible through half-open doors, clustered in small groups, watching. Liray's door was sealed. The Drakes were standing in their doorway with their arms folded. Garza's unit was dark and empty because he was out here with me. And then Dravik's voice came over the corridor communication system, smooth and amplified and carrying the authority of a man who believed he had already won. Residents of Block 7, this is Dravik Keth Voran, authorized representative of the Keth Dominion. I am invoking emergency clan authority for the immediate recovery of Selvari nationals, Seren and Kale. The protective residency claim has been rendered moot by developments that constitute a threat to clan security. I am directing all personnel to facilitate the transfer of the children to Keth custody. Any interference will be treated as obstruction of sovereign clan operations. He had dropped the pretense. No more legal maneuvering, no more diplomatic language, no more patient waiting for the 72-hour clock to expire. He was going to take those children by force, right now, and he was using the station security cordon as his wall. I stood in that corridor, bleeding and exhausted, with dust in my lungs and an evidence drive in my pocket, and I looked at the distance between me and Lyre's door. 40 meters of hallway, a dozen enforcers, and on the other side, a mother and 2 children, waiting to find out if anyone was coming. I started walking. Garza grabbed my arm. You cannot just walk through them. I am not going through them. I am going around them. The corridor was locked down, but the station was not. Dravik had secured the hallway, not the infrastructure. He was thinking like a clan enforcer, controlling the visible ground, the doors and corridors where people moved. He was not thinking like a combat engineer. I pulled Garza and Dorath into a maintenance alcove off the main corridor and spoke fast. Dorath, you have engineering access to the station communication grid. Can you push a broadcast to the civilian network? Every screen, every terminal, every personal device on the station? Dorath blinked. I have level 3 infrastructure access. That includes emergency broadcast capability for engineering alerts. A station-wide push would require a level 2 authorization code, but the emergency system has a bypass for imminent safety hazards. If I classify this as a structural integrity alert, which given the concealed mining operation is technically accurate, I can trigger a station-wide broadcast. Do it. Push everything. Vorath's data, your scan from the tunnels, the equipment serial numbers, the cargo manifest comparisons, all of it. Every piece of evidence we have. Put it on every screen on this station. That will cause a panic. That will cause the truth. Dorath hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then she nodded, opened her scanner, and began working. I turned to Garza. Your dockworker network. Can they relay the broadcast through the cargo communication channels? The ones the dock crews use for shift coordination? Those channels reach every loading bay, every warehouse, and every break room on the cargo ring. Half the working population of this station monitors them during shift. Hit them all. Garza pulled out his comm and started making calls. Quiet, fast, efficient. The dockworker network that had been built on years of shared labor and mutual trust activated in minutes. Simon Pruitt on the lower docks, Claire Beckett on the ore processing level, Voss in the cargo handling bay. Each one received the data package and began relaying it through their own channels. Dorath finished her bypass in under 3 minutes. She looked at me one last time. Once I push this, there is no taking it back. Push it. She triggered the broadcast. The effect was not gradual, it was instantaneous. Every screen in the maintenance alcove flickered and switched to the data feed. Every terminal in the corridor beyond lit up with Vorath's survey maps, the Viridium extraction data, the equipment serial numbers, the cargo manifest discrepancies, and the audio transcript of a dead man's final recording. 40,000 people saw it at once. The station held its breath for about 10 seconds, and then the reaction began. I could hear it through the walls. Voices. Comms activating, doors opening, the deep, rolling murmur of a population discovering that something terrible had been happening beneath their feet, funded by an entity that was at this very moment trying to take 2 children from their mother to cover it up. The reaction moved through the station in waves. First the residential blocks, where people were waking up to screens filled with evidence of treason. Then the commercial ring, where shop owners and traders saw the cargo manifest data and recognized the phantom shipments that had passed through their sections without explanation. Then the mine workers, who pulled up Vorath's geological surveys and realized that a colleague they had mourned as a victim of mechanical failure had actually been murdered for doing his job. The anger was not loud, it was deep, the kind that settles into bones and does not leave. In the corridor, the station security officers were staring at their personal devices. The data was playing on their screens too. The young Bravari officer who had told me about the containment order looked up from her comm with an expression that had shifted from discomfort to something harder. Dravik's voice came over the corridor comm again, but this time it had lost its smooth authority. This broadcast is unauthorized and contains fabricated data. Station security is directed to maintain the containment perimeter and disregard all unauthorized communications. Nobody moved, but nobody was following his orders either. I walked out of the maintenance alcove and into the corridor. Garza walked beside me. Dorath followed, her scanner still recording. The Keth enforcers at the near end of the hallway shifted their positions, hands moving to sidearms, eyes locked on us. They were trained professionals, and they were doing their jobs, but they were also watching the same data feed as everyone else on the station, and the look in their eyes told me they were running calculations that no amount of training had prepared them for. "Stand down," I said, not to the enforcers, to the station security officers behind them. "You have seen the evidence. There is an illegal weapons-grade mineral extraction operation running under this station, in violation of the Galactic Arms Limitation Treaty. Your containment order was issued under false pretenses by a representative of the organization responsible. You have no obligation to enforce it." The young Bravari officer looked at her superior. Her superior looked at the data on his screen. Then he looked at Dravik's enforcers. Then he looked at me. "Stand down," the superior said to his team. "This is no longer our operation." The security line dissolved. Officers stepped aside, some of them looking relieved, others looking confused, all of them looking at their screens. The Keth enforcers, now standing alone without station security backing, held their positions for another 30 seconds before the reality of their situation became clear. They were 6 people in a corridor that was rapidly filling with residents who had just learned what the Keth Dominion had been doing to their home. They withdrew, professionally, without panic, but they withdrew. I walked the 40 meters to Lyrae's door and knocked. 3 knocks. The same pattern she had used on mine 2 nights ago. The door opened. Lyrae stood behind it with Saren and Kale pressed against her, and her bioluminescence was flickering wildly, pulsing between fear and hope and something fiercer than both. "It is done," I said. "The evidence is public. The whole station knows." She did not speak. She reached out and gripped my arm with both hands and held on, and the glow in her skin stabilized into a steady, warm pulse that lit up the doorway like a beacon. Then the corridor comm activated one final time. Not Dravik. A different voice. Clipped and official, carrying the weight of someone who had been forced out of political caution and into action. "This is Councillor Thade Rannoch. An emergency session of the Station Council has been convened. All Keth Dominion personnel are ordered to report to the diplomatic wing immediately. Station security will escort. Pending the outcome of the emergency session, all Keth enforcement actions on this station are suspended effective immediately. This includes Reclamation Order 7714, Councillor Rannoch out." The corridor erupted, not in chaos, but in the sound of doors opening and people stepping out and voices talking over each other, and the particular, unmistakable energy of a community that had just discovered it was angrier and more united than it knew. But it was not over. Not yet. I knew it was not over, because I knew Dravik, or rather, I knew his type. I had met men like him in every conflict zone I had ever worked in, men who operated on a principle so deeply embedded that it survived the collapse of every plan built on top of it. The principle was simple. Possession is everything. If you hold the objective, the paperwork follows. He was going to make one more move. I told Lyrae to stay inside. I told Saren to lock the door. And then I walked back into the corridor and waited, because I knew where he would come from. The service corridor. Every residential block on Havel Station had one. A narrow utility passage running behind the main hallway, used for plumbing access, power conduit maintenance, and atmospheric system routing. It was not monitored, it was not guarded, and it had access points behind every residential unit on the block. Dravik came through the service access door 17 minutes after the council announcement. He was alone. No enforcers, no backup, no tactical gear. Just a tall Selvari in clan attire, moving with the controlled precision of someone who had decided that, if the system would not give him what he wanted, he would take it himself. He saw me and stopped. We stood 10 meters apart in the residential corridor. Behind me, Lyra's door. Behind him, the service corridor that would take him back into the station's infrastructure, and from there, to the diplomatic docking bay where his ship was waiting. If he got past me with 2 children, he could be off station before anyone could stop him. "Move," he said. "No. The council will stall for days. Committees, reviews, deliberations. By the time they act, I will be in Keth space with the children, and no ruling from a frontier station council will reach me there. You are not taking those children." He moved toward me. Not running, not charging, just walking with the certainty of someone who had spent his entire life being the most dangerous person in any room he entered. He was taller than me by a head, his limbs were longer, his reflexes evolved from a lineage of apex predators, and the way he carried his weight told me he had training that went far beyond what an enforcer typically received. He was faster than me, stronger than me, better adapted to violence in every measurable way. I set my feet and did not move. He hit me with a strike that came from below my sight line, fast and precise, aimed at the nerve cluster on the side of my neck. I took it on the shoulder instead, and the impact spun me sideways into the corridor wall. Pain bloomed from my collarbone to my fingertips, and for a moment, my left arm went numb. I pushed off the wall and swung the torch wrench. He blocked it with his forearm, the impact ringing through the corridor like a bell. His hand closed around my wrist and squeezed, and the pressure was enormous. I felt bones shift. The wrench clattered to the floor. He drove me backward, toward Lyra's door, and I understood with perfect clarity that he intended to go through me the same way he intended to go through the door. An obstacle, nothing more. I dropped my weight. He expected me to resist backward, to push against his momentum, and when I went down instead, he overbalanced for half a second. I used that half second to drive my knee into his midsection with everything I had. It was not elegant. It was not skillful. It was the kind of ugly, desperate, close-quarters fighting that humans had refined over millennia of being outmatched by everything on their own planet and refusing to die. He staggered back. I got to my feet. Blood was running from somewhere on my face, and my left arm was still half numb, and every breath felt like inhaling glass. "You cannot win this," he said, and he was not wrong. On any physical metric, on any rational assessment, he was right. I could not beat him. But that was not the point. The point was that I was still standing, still between him and that door, and every second I stayed there was a second that Lyra and her children remained safe. He came at me again. I took the hit and stayed up. He struck me again, and I stayed up. He hit me a third time, and I went down, and I got back up. Something in my ribs was broken. Something in my wrist was wrong. My vision was tunneling at the edges. I stayed up. And then there were other people in the corridor. Not fighting, standing. The Drakes, side by side, blocking the width of the hallway behind me. Garza, bleeding from a cut above his eye, positioning himself at my left shoulder. The Bravari couple from down the hall, the ones whose names I had never learned, stepping into the space on my right. Dorath, still holding her scanner, standing with her back against Lyra's door. More came, humans and aliens, neighbors who had watched through their doors and decided that watching was not enough. They filed into the corridor and filled it, body by body, until the space between Dravik and Lyra's door was a wall of people who had no weapons, and no training, and absolutely no intention of moving. Dravik looked at the wall. He looked at me, battered and swaying and still standing. He looked at the corridor full of faces, some frightened, some angry, all resolved. And he stopped. Not because he could not fight through them. He probably could have. But because something had broken in the calculation. The math that his entire life was built on, the math that said power was physical, and authority was force, and possession was everything, had encountered a variable it could not process. A corridor full of ordinary people who should have stepped aside and did not. Station security arrived 4 minutes later. Dravik was taken into custody without resistance. He walked between two officers with his back straight and his expression blank and said nothing. But as he passed me, he slowed for half a step. He did not look at me. He looked at the wall of people behind me, the humans and aliens who had filled the corridor and refused to move, and something in his face shifted. Not anger, not defeat, something closer to bewilderment, as if he had just witnessed a physical law being violated, gravity reversing, or light bending backward, and could not reconcile what he had seen with what he knew to be true. Then he was gone, and the corridor was ours. Liray's door opened. She stood in the doorway with Kale in her arms and Saren at her side, and she looked at the corridor full of people, at their faces, at the ones who were bleeding, and the ones who were crying, and the ones who were simply standing with their shoulders squared and their eyes steady, and her bioluminescence flared brighter than I had ever seen it. A brilliant, pulsing wave of blue-white light that washed down the corridor like a sunrise. Several of the Bravari residents flinched at the intensity. The humans did not look away. The emergency council session lasted 6 hours. I was not present for most of it, because a medical team insisted on treating my injuries, which turned out to include 2 cracked ribs, a fractured wrist, a mild concussion, and enough bruising to make me look like I had lost a fight with a piece of mining equipment, which, in a way, I had. The results came through on the corridor comm, while I was sitting in Lyray's apartment with my arm in a sling and a cup of cold coffee in my good hand. The Viridium extraction operation was confirmed by independent station survey teams, dispatched to the concealed tunnels. The operation was shut down and sealed, pending a full investigation by the Interstellar Regulatory Authority. All Keth Dominion personnel were expelled from Havel Station, and a formal complaint was filed with the Galactic Arms Limitation Treaty Enforcement Body. Dravek Keth Voran was detained for extradition proceedings related to treaty violations and obstruction of station governance. Vorath's death was reclassified as a homicide. A joint investigation was opened between station security and the Human Criminal Justice Liaison, the first such joint investigation in the station's history. Reclamation Order 7714 was voided, permanently. And the protective residency claim that I had filed at 5 in the morning 3 days ago, the desperate legal maneuver of a retired engineer with no legal training, became the foundation of something none of us expected. The council adopted it, not just as a resolution to this specific case, but as a new station-wide statute. They called it the Callaway Precedent in the official records, but the residents of Havel Station called it something else. They called it the Human Standard. The principle was simple. No child on Havel Station could be separated from a living, willing parent by clan law, species tradition, or external authority. Parenthood was not a clan asset. It was not a political tool. It was not a commodity to be reclaimed by bureaucratic fiat. A child belonged with the people who loved them, and no power in the galaxy was large enough to override that. It was the first legal framework of its kind in the sector. Within weeks, other frontier colonies began requesting copies of the statute. Within months, 3 more stations adopted their own versions. A Bravari trade hub near the Galactic Rim wrote the language into their own charter word for word. A Torvani settlement that had struggled with similar clan custody disputes for generations used it as the basis for a complete overhaul of their family law. The Human Standard spread the way good ideas spread, not through force or diplomacy, but through the simple recognition that it was right. Conrad Perry, the Human Affairs liaison who had looked at me like I was burning down his office, sent me a message 2 weeks after the ruling. It was short. It said, "I was wrong. Thank you." I appreciated that more than any commendation. Garza healed faster than I did, because Garza was built like industrial equipment and seemed to process damage the same way. He went back to the docks within a week, and the story of what happened in the tunnels spread through the cargo ring in the way that dockworker stories do, growing slightly more dramatic with each retelling, until Garza was apparently fighting off a dozen enforcers with his bare hands. He did not correct the exaggerations. He enjoyed them. Dorath received a commendation from the station engineering board for identifying and documenting a critical infrastructure hazard. She accepted it with typical Bravari reserve, and then submitted a 40-page report on the structural risks posed by unregulated subsurface excavation that became required reading for every infrastructure engineer on the station. I did not set out to change the law. I set out to keep a promise to a woman who knocked on my door at 2 in the morning, because she had nowhere else to go. The days after the council ruling were quiet, in the way that silence falls after a storm. The residential block returned to its rhythms, shift workers heading to the mines, children playing in the common areas, the low hum of a community going about the ordinary business of living. But something had changed in the texture of it. Doors that used to stay closed were left open. Neighbors who used to nod in passing stopped to talk. The corridor that had filled with people standing together did not forget what it felt like to stand together. Liray and the children stayed in their apartment next to mine. She did not leave the station. She did not return to Selvari space. She stayed, because Havel Station was her home, the place where she and Vorath had built a life that was theirs, and she was not going to let anyone take that from her either. One evening, about a week after everything settled, I was sitting outside my door on the metal bench that I had never used before because I had never wanted to be that visible. My arm was still in the sling, and my ribs ached when I breathed too deeply, and the bruises had faded from purple to a sickly yellow that made me look worse than I felt. Liray came out and sat beside me. She did not say anything for a while. We watched the corridor. Down at the far end, Saren and Kale were playing a game with 2 human children from the Drake's apartment, something involving magnetic tiles and a great deal of laughter that had no species-specific rules. Kale's voice was high and bright, and nothing like the terrified silence he had carried when his mother brought him through my door. Vorath's recording, Liray said, his last words. He said humans do not look away. I heard. Why is that true? I thought about the question for a long time. I thought about every time in my life I had seen something wrong and had to choose between comfort and action. I thought about the corridor full of neighbors who had no obligation to stand there and stood there anyway. I thought about Garza, who never hesitated. About the Drakes, who stepped into a fight that was not theirs. About Claire Beckett and Simon Pruitt and Voss and every person who took a thread of evidence and wove it into a rope strong enough to pull the truth out of the dark. I do not know, I said. It is just what we do. Liray's bioluminescence pulsed softly, that warm blue-white glow that meant trust, and she sat beside me in the corridor light and said nothing else, because nothing else needed to be said. I came to Havel Station to disappear, to stop being part of anything, to fix machines instead of problems, and sleep without dreaming about the ones I could not fix. And then a widow knocked on my door with a plea that changed everything, and I remembered that being human was never something I could retire from. The wrench was still on my counter, where I had left it. The coffee maker was still on the kitchen shelf. My small apartment was still quiet and spare and ordinary. But the door was open now. I left it open, and if anyone ever knocked again, at 2 in the morning or 2 in the afternoon, afraid and desperate and running out of options, they would find what Vorath trusted they would find. Someone who would not look away.